I'm Gina Morrison from the Division of Global Cultures, and I'm here at Wilkes University, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the first of 3 global conversations presented to you by the Global Cultures program at Wilkes. Before I present today's speaker, I'd like to remind you that this session is being recorded for educational purposes. Kindly mute yourself to eliminate the background noise, and find the chat option where you can enter your questions, which will be addressed later. Our guest today will speak to us for about 45 minutes to an hour, followed by the Q&A portion of the session. And by the way, mark your calendars for the next 2 speakers in our series. On March 16th, ethnomusicologist and jazz artist Adam Zanolini will zoom in from Chicago to have a conversation with us about music as a globalizing force of healing. And on April 20th, women's rights activist Umaira Ahmad will zoom in from Europe to discuss global feminist advocacy. Registration is required. But now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker, Govind Nair. And I'm going to spotlight him so you can see us both. Okay, here he is. And he's a global strategist with 25 years of experience with the World Bank, where he served in several capacities, including as lead economist, after which he became president and CEO of Hemispheres Solutions, a global training and consultancy practice. Currently teaching at George Washington University, Professor Nair has given lectures and keynote addresses in every continent on this globe. I was lucky enough to hear him speak in Malaysia about 11 years ago, and then we ran into each other again about 8 years ago. So I'm absolutely thrilled that he is here with us today to have a conversation about how we can develop a global mindset in our post-pandemic future. May it come soon. I present to you now, Govind Nair.
Thank you very much, Gina, for that kind introduction. Hello to all of you. And good afternoon to you, all of you at Wilkes University, for the core of this audience. I don't know if some of the guests I had also invited from other parts of the world outside the US are with us. But if you are in Europe, hello, good evening, bonsoir. I know that there are maybe a couple of you from France. And if you're in Australia, good Thursday morning to you. Now, I'm really happy to be here today because I think the timing of our discussion is extremely appropriate. We have all, in the last 12 or so months, collectively around the world, been through a very intense and unusual experience. Now, I know that we always live in times that we each like to say is unique in history. This has always been said throughout history. But I know that at least in my lifetime, and I'm sure this is true for at least most of you, we've gone through probably the most unusual year recently, because I don't think there's been another time again in my lifetime where around the world our daily routines have become so extensively disrupted. Our work life, our family life, travel, and so on. And I want at this point, to say that, I hope that all of you are continuing to keep well and safe. I know that this has also been a time of difficulty, even loss, sometimes in our immediate circle, and if not in our immediate circle, in the second tier or third tier of contacts we've had. And in fact, I would expect that given the numbers that we have seen around the world, that in some ways we are all connected to each other in terms of how this pandemic has affected us. So I think, like many of you, I am now thinking about what the world might look like as we emerge, hopefully sooner than later, from this pandemic into some kind of post-pandemic normal. and what the world, how the world will continue to unfold in the next 5 to 10 years. Now, I'm not going to propose to you that I have the answers. I'm still very much in the preliminary stage of my own thoughts about this, and I'll offer some of them toward the end. Why toward the end? Because I think it's helpful to first have a build-up of how we got in the first place to where we are, at least over the last 30 or so years, and I think that will put in context some of the rest of the discussion on where we might go in the future. Now, before we begin, let me say that I am very happy to kind of zoom out from what I traditionally talk about, because I talk about fairly specialized topics in globalization usually. In the various workshops I've done with business leaders or government leaders, most of the time my area of specialty, partly based on my experience at the World Bank, which I left as an early retiree in 2010 and then formed my own company for 8 years. I spent a lot of time talking about how small and medium companies in advanced emerging economies could enter world markets, and how governments, through their policies, could support those kinds of companies. I also did discussions on how global companies could enter global markets, and in particular some of the newer markets. So these are fairly specialized topics, usually done in one-day workshops where I present up to 120 graphs and slides, very intense discussion. And at the end of the day, everything is forgiven and forgotten, and we're all drinking wine and enjoying that. Now, we're not going to be doing that today. I'm not going to be running through a lot of graphs. In fact, I want to zoom out and talk about this subject much more generally, and I find that is going to be a very interesting and somewhat unusual experience for me. But before we get started, I want to sort of set the terms, or make sure that we look at two key terms in ways that I feel are useful for this discussion. And one of them is culture, since this is a global culture series, and the other is globalization. And rather than give you a definition, I want to do a bit of a mental exercise with you. And I'm going to ask you all to think or imagine, and this is an experience I'm sure most of you, or most likely all of you have had. Imagine that you are during rush hour in the subway in New York. Well, if it's not New York City, Washington, D.C., where I used to take the metro, from downtown D.C. to the suburb I lived in, or Chicago, or if not in the United States, the underground in London or Paris. So you know what that scene looks like. People are getting into a packed train. Okay, so that's, I think, should be fairly familiar to most of you. Now then, imagine for a second, through some random fluctuation of all the molecules in our body, you're suddenly transported in space and time to the main train station in Tokyo, Japan, or Osaka, Japan, the other big major city in Japan, and you're comparing these two scenes at rush hour. And if you haven't seen this, as many of you may have actually been to these train stations in Japan, and if you have not, if you're planning to visit Japan, I would definitely recommend you do that, because it is an experience. I've done this several times when I've taken the bullet train in my visits across Japan, and just watched this fascinating scene where the incoming train stops and the doors exactly line up at a particular spot on the platform, which is marked out. Passengers who are on the train leave the train in a very orderly fashion, and the passengers who are boarding are also very lined up in a very orderly way, and they enter the train. And of course, you have the same packed situation that you'd have in New York or London or elsewhere. But it's a very different experience. Now, how do you explain the difference? Now, I think our immediate thought would be, well, there's a cultural difference here. And we often use the word culture to denote differences. But if you think about the scene, and if you imagine we were zooming into a part of the scene, and by the way, I've taken photographs of this around the world too, you might, for example, move to a portion of the platform where there are 5 teenagers, and if you just look at them from head down to about this level, you'd see that their heads are bowed. And if you move your camera lower down, you see that all of them, whether they're in New York or Washington or London or Tokyo or Osaka, they're looking at their mobile phones or some other device. In other words, they're behaving the same way regardless of whether they're in Japan or somewhere else. So the point that I want to make is when we talk about cultures, there are really at least two sets of dynamics that are always playing out. There's this dynamics of divergence where cultures move in different directions, in certain respects. So we find people, approach the issues of family, marriage, work, hierarchical relations, the position of the individual with respect to society differently. But there are also ways in which behaviors, are, especially now, beginning to resemble each other more and more. And some people might attribute this to youth culture, to globalization, to globalized culture. But this is not actually that new. And this is the point that I want to make, because very often when we talk about cultures, we tend to talk about it in an ethnographic sense, where we take a snapshot and we say that, in this particular society, this is how elders are treated. In this other society, this is how marriages are done. So we take these snapshots, we take particular aspects at a particular slice in time. But if we zoom out, and if we look at our whole history as a species, and we begin to think of culture, not in this narrow sense, but in this much broader sense. If you look at the word culture, culture has a Latin root, and that Latin root denotes cultivation, agriculture, seeding, and some languages, French and other Latin languages, are much closer to that original meaning, while also talking about culture in the contemporary sense that we use in English, for example. I think what we will see is that we have always been a globalizing species. From the time we came out of Africa, and this is the dominant hypothesis, Homo sapiens, our species, came out of Africa and then we populated the world. And there are some other theories about this, but we won't get into that today. And we know the story, going into Europe, encountering the Neanderthals, the Denisovians in Central Asia, Homo florensis, and so on. But eventually we were left with our species, Homo sapiens, and we developed different cultures. And those cultures developed because we had this capacity to develop myth and symbols and institutions which were abstract. You don't see this myth and symbols in nature. We created them. And around these symbols and myth, I'm using myth in the broader sense, we then created the mechanisms that govern our social behavior. And this happens, in every society, but it may play out differently. But while this happens, we're also exchanging. Different societies have always exchanged with each other. When agriculture began in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, and at the same time in ancient Egypt and in China during the Indus Valley civilization, ideas were being exchanged about animal husbandry, agriculture, and so on. And this has continued through trading networks in history. So we have always been a globalizing species which has exchanged ideas. Now, I want to keep this in the background because we're going to come back to this theme of us as a globalizing species and exchanging ideas, not just goods and services, which is the narrow interpretation of globalization. And particularly if you look at economic literature, I'm an economist, so I see this, or business literature, we tend to look at globalization as the narrow exchange of goods and services. I think, and particularly now, what is increasingly important is the exchange of intangibles, of knowledge, of ideas, even data. So we're going to come back to this. I want us to put this at the back of our minds for the moment. Okay, I have a list of topics here that I was asked to address. I don't know if I'll be able to go through all of them in the time that I have, but what I'm going to do as I speak about them is to throw out questions. Hopefully I will get to the point where I can answer all of them, but if I don't, I would please ask you to ask those questions, or if you don't like those questions, ask something else. But one thing I think that is important to bear in mind is if you're engaged globally, working with different cultures, it is very important to be driven by your passion for the question. And why do I say this? Because when you're in contact with other cultures, those questions are never completely answered. And if you think about this in terms of knowledge, or the philosophy of knowledge, it cannot be completely answered, because we are always coming into a situation as an observer with a certain amount of cultural baggage. We are observing another culture with a different set of ideas. There may be some commonalities, between them. But there's some degree to which we know certain things. We know that there are other things we don't know. There are certain things we don't know, and we know that we don't know them, and there are things we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know. That is typically the situation we're always in. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that our experience, if you want, has different aspects that falls into each of those four quadrants. And I'm going to use this as kind of a device to look at least one of my own experiences, and I'll do this toward the end, and on which I was interviewed a lot when I was at the World Bank as a project experience, which I think speaks to this very important idea of having a passion for cultural encounter and cultural engagement. Okay, so this gets me to the subject of the World Bank. Now, I was asked to speak about this. This is not the title of my presentation. This is what I really wanted to speak about, and I hope I will get to speak about that a lot. But I'm going to approach the World Bank through my own experience. Not that it is, and I don't say this with any false modesty, and I'm going to say not because my own experiences are particularly representative or even that interesting, but because I did have 7 careers at the World Bank. And by describing the succession of these different careers that I followed, I will be able to do 2 things. Number one, I will be able to, and I can do this now because now that I've left the World Bank, I can look at that 25-year experience for the first time as one piece and look back at how it unfolded. I can see the relationship between what I did at a particular point in time and how certain ideas were developing in the arena of development policy, development economics, and so on. So I'm almost taking an intellectual history approach to what I was doing. But the reason I'm doing that is because I'm going to take the same approach then to look back at that same period of time, but much more broadly, to see how our attitudes towards globalization have evolved, particularly in the last 30 years, and particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall. So let me start at the World Bank. Now, my career at the World Bank actually started while I was still in graduate school. Actually, it started with a summer job, a summer internship I came down to the World Bank for a summer. They had asked me, there was a part of the World Bank, a projects department in the West Africa wing of the World Bank, which at that time was very interested in the issue of state government-owned enterprises. Now, at that time, in the mid-1980s, around the world, there was a lot of both academic discussion, but also policy change around the relationship between governments, the state, and the market. And to what extent should governments be involved directly in production, in utilities, for example, even in delivering services such as health and education. And we remember the Reagan Revolution, the Thatcher Revolution, this wave of privatization. So there was a lot happening in the world in this arena. And there was a lot of research in the World Bank as to what this meant for developing countries. So I was invited to look at a very small analysis of how state-owned banks in one West African country, it happened to be Senegal, how this problem of the relationship between state-owned banks and state enterprises was unfolding. I've given 3 months to do this. I was asked to do this because I spoke French. It was a French-speaking country, and I had some experience in banking before. So I did that, and I wrote a little report, which was quite well received. And when I went back to graduate school, I continued, because I found this a very interesting exercise. I actually did an independent study on this subject. And as I was doing that, I one day got a call from the World Bank because someone had seen my work, and they were interested, this time the research wing of the bank was interested in me doing a much broader analysis for all of Africa. And so I started, coming down to the World Bank once a week. I'd take the train from Princeton, New Jersey. I was doing my graduate work at Princeton. And, come usually on a Friday, stay until a weekend. So I got to enjoy Washington, D.C. But I had a little office where I was gathering lots of documents and putting a lot of data together in a large spreadsheet. Now remember, this was the 1980s. This was before the internet revolution. This was before the World Wide Web. We didn't have search engines. In fact, I would say I was, relative to where we are in information technology today, I was in the Stone Age. I was literally chiseling data into stone. Not literally, metaphorically. But that was where we were at. It's going to be very unfamiliar to those of you who have grown up as digital natives in the world of the World Wide Web and the internet. But I spent a lot of time gathering this data, and it became very interesting to a lot of people, what this research was showing. Data is very important. For those of you who do social science research, you know that if you have command of the data, you are able to speak more and more authoritatively about a subject. So I then, after doing this work, got involved in another piece of research, and this time it was even much larger, the whole world. And I got invited to join a team that was working on the annual report of the research wing of the World Bank, the World Development Report. This is the premier publication of the World Bank. And in 1988, the subject changes every year, the subject was public finance and development. And they were interested in me doing an analysis of how state-owned enterprises around the world affected government finances. So I did a lot of research and data, and I actually got to write a chapter in that report, which was unusual because most people who join the World Development Report do so after 10 or 15 years of research, whether it's at the bank or in a university, and have established a name in a certain area. I had not, other than I had been involved in this particular area where I was unearthing data. And at that point in time, you might say I was at the right place at the right time. It was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot. I mean, the World Bank has been a wonderful place for learning. So when I finished with that work, I then joined the World Bank, but I left the research wing of the World Bank, and I got involved in another area. This was toward the end of the 1980s. This was in the area of finance, and particularly the relationship between finance and the economy, because at that time, people were beginning to think, well, there's actually a relationship between how credit markets work and how what they call the real economy in economics works. And so I did a few rotations at first at the World Bank. I worked in a group that was trying to develop stock exchanges around the world. I went to Hungary in 1989, saw this little committee that sat around the table, the precursor to what is now the Budapest Stock Exchange. They were trying to trade little pieces of paper, if you want. I went around Europe trying to sell a fund for a Portuguese investment bank that was looking for money in Europe to invest in small and medium-sized companies. The 1992 fund, 1992, for the Maastricht Agreement in Europe that created, that led to the European Monetary Union and eventually the euro currency. I also worked in the treasury of the World Bank borrowing money, because the World Bank is actually an institution that doesn't entirely, in fact, largely depends on borrowing money, and borrowing money by issuing bonds like a government with a AAA rating, so it's able to borrow money at a very cheap rate in very large amounts. At least when I was there, we were borrowing about $25 billion every year in different currencies. And I was working on what was then the Deutsche Mark desk. This is the German currency, the Deutschmark. It doesn't exist anymore because the Deutschmark has since been replaced by the European-wide currency, the euro. So I did all of that work, and then I finally spent a few years working in the Africa region on financial markets. And this is where I got involved with writing a report on financial development in Madagascar, and then managing a project in which I was trying to modernize the Central Bank of Madagascar. And in doing this project, I suddenly got exposed to the whole area of information technology, because in this project, what we were trying to do, and this also shows you the age of the technology. At that time, the big revolution in IT was moving away from mainframes to client-server technology. Now, if you listen to that today, you're saying, wow, that was centuries ago, right? The word cloud computing did not even exist, let alone the internet, the World Wide Web. But this was a revolution. I learned a lot about information technology, and I started getting interested in this subject and also in communications. And I ended up writing a report for another country, Mauritius, a neighboring country to Madagascar, on how to create an information-based economy, which is a very unusual topic. That was not something that it was pioneering at the World Bank, but because I happened to work on it, I was then invited to join a part of the World Bank, which is then financing telecoms, and was shifting away from financing state companies to deregulating telecom sectors, bringing in mobile communications. So again, I learned a whole lot. I learned a lot about frequency spectrum management, numbering plans, interconnection, all the things you have to do if you're going to help a government put in a telecommunication systems with multiple operators, and particularly using mobile technology. So I went around the world advising governments, managing projects. One of the things I did, and I won't tell too many stories, but there are one or two stories which I think are particularly interesting. One of the things I did in the course of doing one of my projects, it was in Mali, a country in Western Africa, is I actually visited Timbuktu. You know, we talk about Timbuktu almost as a metaphor when you go to a faraway place. Well, it is actually a place in northern Mali. It was the seat of a major 13th century empire. And I'd arrived there, and 20 minutes after arriving there, I was in a tent sipping tea with 8 Tuareg nomads who told me they'd never used a telephone. I was there trying to bring mobile communications. It was very interesting. And at that point, it clicked on me. Well, I'd heard this statistic, 800 million people never having heard a dial tone. Well, I met 8 of them that day. And it was a very interesting discussion we had about how they led their lives. These were people, although they'd never used a phone, they were listening to the BBC in Arabic every day because they found very important trading news. And these were traders who would take their camels across North Africa using the same kind of celestial navigation, using stars as they had been for centuries. And we started talking about how they could eventually use a chip on a camel to track their camels, because you normally spend 2 or 3 days finding a camel if you lost one in the Sahara. So a fascinating conversation which actually helped my work. And a couple of years later, we had a very successful project. I'll talk about that more later because this is a project that was quoted a lot at the World Bank. Now, at the same time that I was looking at telecommunications, I was also looking at applications of information technology. One of the things I also did at that time is I had an initiative to explore how these IT applications could be used in small islands in the Pacific. So I was visiting several of the islands, nations in the Pacific, and I was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at one point in a country called Kiribati, which is just a group of atolls in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And I'd asked to see the representatives of the private sector. I saw all of them, all 5 of them. They came into a thatched roof hut, which was the Ministry of Statistics. And there they were in their Hawaiian shirts, and there I was with my PowerPoint slides talking about how telecommunications and the internet was evolving around the world. This was in 1998, I believe. And one of the persons in the group then said, you know, we don't have the internet here in Kiribati, but I pay $5 a minute to dial into my CompuServe account. CompuServe was one of the major internet providers at that time. It doesn't exist anymore, CompuServe and AOL. You can see this was only 30 years ago, but the world has changed since. But he said, I pay $5 a minute because I can get useful information and then I sell it here on the island. My point here is that you're going to find all over the world little entrepreneurs like this who come up with ideas, who find little ways to use technology, to use the best of what they can find, and to develop this into a business. It's fascinating, and it's fascinating, for example, to see how women in the marketplace in West Africa started selling these mobile phone cards, prepaid cards, and how this resulted in a very, very successful telecoms revolution in West Africa, using the social capital inside the heads of these women in the market. Very interesting human experience. Now, still talking about people one encounters, 2 weeks later, after doing my trip to the Pacific Islands, I was actually in Latin America, and I was taking a group of people from Mauritania in West Africa, where I was doing a project. I took them to Peru and Bolivia to study how Peru and Bolivia had engaged in the same kinds of telecoms reforms years earlier. And I landed in La Paz, Bolivia, and as I got off the plane, I met a baggage handler who asked me if I had any currency with me, different currencies, because apparently he collected currency. This is very interesting. I then reached into my pocket or my pouch, I don't remember, and I pulled out a whole bunch of currency that I had from my visit 2 weeks earlier in the Pacific Islands, the other end of the world, and I gave it to him. And he looked at it note by note, and he started identifying the countries and telling me a little bit about the countries. I was amazed. This was a Quechua-speaking Indian. I don't speak Quechua, I spoke to him in Spanish, so we talked a little bit, who told me that he just loved reading about the world. He'd never been outside Bolivia, but he knew all the currency notes of the world. I was amazed. I only had 3 minutes to talk to him because I had my delegation. But it just goes to show you that there are always people in the world. You don't have to be part of the global urban cosmopolitan elite that we are all part of. You know, we have the opportunity, you know, to study, to read, to watch film. There are people who don't have those same opportunities, but who nonetheless have an interest in the world and a curiosity. And here was one example. So let me fast forward a bit. I left my work, my very interesting work in telecoms and information technology after about 5 or 6 years, and I joined another part of the World Bank which was involved in training. And one of the things I did there was I ran 3 different workshops over 1.5 years for the entire cabinet of Madagascar, from the president, prime minister. And this is a very interesting experience where I brought in specialists in different areas. We go over a weekend into a retreat, and we try to do things that would help the government move forward. And this is the whole area of, those of you who are in development may have heard this term, capacity building. Now, the reason I raise capacity building as an issue is because people often think that capacity building is training, it's giving people skills. Well, it's a lot more than that, because to achieve capacity, you mustn't just have skills, you must also have the political will, the social will to apply those skills to specific problems. And if you don't have that, you're not going to solve the problem. Now, fast forward to today, and I'm going to ask you to think about, do you know of a place in the world where there are a lot of skills, in fact, there's every imaginable technology skill, there's also money, and yet there isn't the will to solve problems. A place where, for the last several weeks, people are still being asked to boil water because their pipes have broken down. People no longer have the electricity that they took for granted. People are being told not to wear masks. I mean, all of we have the best, this is a place that has some of the best hospitals and universities in the world. Of course, you know that we don't have to look outside the United States to know what I'm talking about. And my point here is that we need to be very careful when we talk about capacity and avoid this kind of paternalistic idea that we who live in the so-called developed world, and I shy away from that term now, necessarily have all the skills and knowledge to transmit to developing countries and to help solve their problems. I think we need to revisit this lexicon, and including terms like the third world. And I'll come to that, and if I don't come to that, please quiz me on that toward the end. So I was working in capacity development. Fast forwarding again, I moved to Indonesia. I got a job in the Jakarta office of the World Bank, and I was living in Australia at the same time I was commuting. I'm also an Australian. In fact, I was an Australian before I became an American. Just as a side note. The Indonesia experience, I'm going to just cite one thing. I was very fortunate when I was working in Indonesia to be able to travel very widely in Indonesia. Indonesia, if you know, is an archipelago of 17,000 islands that stretches from west to south to the equivalent of about 1/6 of the Earth's circumference. That's how far-flung it is. And when I first came to Indonesia, I thought, listen, I speak the language because I grew up in Malaysia, a neighboring country, and the languages are very similar, and I had to learn Malay in my childhood, and I said, oh, it's going to be very easy for me. Well, it was very hard. When I was in Jakarta, I had a hard time, and I couldn't understand why. I said, has my Malay become this rusty? And it wasn't until a month later when I visited another island, the Celebes, that all of a sudden, everything became clear to me. People were talking, and I could understand them. And I said, wow, what is the difference? Well, I found out that the Celebes was actually the home of the original Malay, and this is where the first Malay dictionary was written in the 16th or 17th century. Okay, now, why I talk about that is because the whole history of the Malayo-Polynesian cultures and the whole diaspora of the Malayo-Polynesian peoples extends from Hawaii all the way through Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Maoris in New Zealand, across the Indian Ocean to Madagascar, where when I first visited, I heard this language that sounded familiar to me, around the Cape in South Africa to Guyana. In fact, it's one of the world's largest diasporas. We don't usually hear much about it, but there's a very interesting chapter in a book many of you, I'm sure, have read, Guns, Germs, and Steel, by Jared Diamond, who devotes an entire chapter using a lot of ethno-linguistic literature to show the ties between all of these populations, which had a great navigational tradition over many, many centuries. So just a little episode there, just to relate to you how, doing all this kind of work, many, many things can, come to you in an unexpected way. So I'll fast forward again. I ended up my World Bank career working on public-private partnerships, and I'm going to stop there. Okay, so why did I do all of this? Why did I give you the trajectory of my World Bank career? not really so much to talk about myself. I had the opportunity to work in several different areas. And this then gets to the question, what is the World Bank? Is the World Bank a university? I've worked in research. We have one of the biggest assemblies of economists in the world, several hundred, who do a lot of research, to publish a lot. I was in a small way involved in that at the beginning. Is it a lending agency like a commercial bank? We make very large loans. Is it an investment, an investor? Because we also take equity. Still, there's an affiliate of the bank that works with the private sector that actually takes equity in companies. Or is it a training institution? I also work there, the World Bank Institute. Well, the World Bank does all of these things, but the key concept that links all of these different functions is the notion of being a cooperative. The World Bank is a cooperative owned by, I think today must be about 190 or plus or minus. I don't remember the exact. It's 190 plus or minus one or two. You can check this. Governments. It's a cooperative. It's a cooperative that originated in the ashes of the Second World War. You know, toward the end of the Second World War, as you know, there was this big conference in San Francisco in 1944, which set up the United Nations. In 1945, there was another conference which set up the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and an agency called the GATT, which is the predecessor to what we call today the WTO, to look at trading relations. All of these institutions, why were they set up? They were set up to develop what we call a global architecture of rules to ensure that the world coming out of the Second World War could enter a period of development, growth, and prosperity. And that was the idea. And in fact, the idea, to a large extent, I would argue, did work. You know, we saw an unprecedented period of prosperity. You know, we've seen a period where, you know, the number of people in poverty has dropped dramatically, you know, by more than 750 million. You know, so this, in many ways, it has been successful as a concept. But I think today in 2021, for many reasons, and as we're coming out of the pandemic, there's specific reasons to ask this. Is this architecture still relevant today? Or should it be adapted? And if so, why? And if so, what exactly? What are the directions in which we should find a new global architecture of rules and institutions? Okay, I may not be able to get to these points, but again, this is something, if I don't get to before I finish, we should try and talk about during the Q&A. And this is a bridge, if you want, to the second big topic I want to take, which is going back to the same period that I was looking at and talking about my time at the World Bank, but looking at it more broadly from the angle of how did we think about globalization beginning in the 1990s after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I take the Berlin Wall as an almost arbitrary watershed because I don't want to go back to the end of the Second World War. That would be a fantastic topic. We just don't have time to discuss that. But the end of the Berlin Wall is interesting because there emerged, once the Berlin Wall fell, and, you know, as we say, communism disappeared from Eastern Europe, the Cold War ended. This is how, especially in the United States, we interpret those developments. May not be viewed quite the same way elsewhere. But there were at least three sets of ideas that emerged. The first idea that emerged was an expectation that after the fall of communism, that liberal democracies would start exploding everywhere around the world, that liberal democracy as an idea would become universal. Okay? And maybe the most emblematic statement of this expectation was a book written by a State Department official, and I'm trying to remember his name. Oh, Francis Fukuyama. Yes, Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History. And his argument, this is exactly his argument, that in fact liberal democracy would become, if you want, the dominant feature of the political landscape all around the world. Now, in fact, that did not pan out entirely. It panned out partially, but that did not pan out. And you just have to look, for example, at what the former Soviet Union went through after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And very rapidly, you know, Gorbachev in the initial years, then Yeltsin was the leader in the mid-1990s, and of course Mr. Putin whom we all know of since the year 2000. This is not the Russia today is not quite the liberal democracy that we all hoped, or many of us hoped in the 1990s it would become for a number of reasons. But this is not just limited to Russia. Liberal democracy has gone through many challenges, not the least here in the United States. We might want to talk about that too in relation to how the world has seen liberal democracy, but also in countries, if you want, such as Brazil, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, the Philippines, even India. We like to call India the world's largest democracy. Tremendous challenges to democratic institutions and practices in India. So we are at a time when there's a lot of questioning about the viability of liberal democracy. Why has this happened when there was so much hope at the beginning of the 1990s? Okay, so that's one set of ideas that developed in the 1990s and resulted in what we and led then to what we see today. Another set of ideas concerns the economic development of the world. Now, there was an expectation after the fall of the Berlin Wall that eventually we would become a single global marketplace. A single global, well, why do people think that? Because particularly with the fall of the Eastern Bloc, which during the Cold War had formed its own trading bloc, all of these countries, plus others, could start opening up to the world market. And in fact, we did see countries, definitely in the Eastern Bloc, Russia, China had already started opening since 1979, and with the revolution that Deng Xiaoping, as many of you know, effected, opening up, allowing farmers to market their output independently. So we had in the 90s, countries like Brazil and Japan, we had in the 1990s many major economies starting to connect with the global economy. In fact, the movement was so big that we might say, and this is not inaccurate at all, that we moved from a world in which 1 billion people were in market economies to 4 billion people being in market, 4 or more billion people being in market economies. So there was this idea that the world, the economy was, the global economy was being more and more interconnected. And there were a whole lot of books with breathlessly titled, titles such as The Borderless World by Kenichi Omai, a strategist from McKinsey, somewhere in the early 1990s. Another one, which many of you may have heard of, The World is Flat. I mean, these books started speaking of the idea that the world economy was going to become this frictionless landscape where goods and services would trade freely. Well, what has actually happened? In fact, although that integration did take place to a large extent, what we also saw, particularly after the Great Recession of 2009, was a backlash against much of this. A greater protectionist stance in the United States and many other countries, and a suspicion of globalization. And in fact, a malignment of globalization, global trade, as being the cause of loss of jobs, particularly in industrial countries, and greater and growing inequality around the world. So now, why did all of this happen? Is this true? Was this not true? Was is globalization to be blamed? Okay, that's another set of questions. I'm not going to sort of answer this now, but I'd be happy to talk about this a bit more if we have time, either during the Q&A or maybe I'll be able to answer this before. A third series of ideas emerged, and those of you who look at globalization from a geopolitical perspective will probably recognize this. This was a set of ideas that had to do with competition among major powers and who would come to dominate or who would come to own the 21st century. And in the 1990s, I'll give you one book which I found interesting, and I remember this book well because I read it on a plane flight going from, I think, Switzerland to South Africa. It was during the Gulf War, and we had to take alternative routes to get to where we're going. So that was an unusual route for me. And I read this book, written by the former dean of the Sloan School at MIT, Lester Thoreau. And the book was called Head to Head, the competition between the United States, Europe, a unified Europe, and Japan to dominate, if you want, the world economy. And it was a very interesting book. I found it really very, very interesting. But there was something that was missing from the analysis. What was missing? What the book missed in the analysis is how important the rest of the world, particularly big, what we call developing countries or emerging countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the so-called BRIC economies, how with the integration in the world, these countries, plus other emerging countries, would soon occupy a more and more important place in the world economy. In fact, if you look at global output, the size of the world economy today, these countries, what we used to call the developing countries, today represent more than half of the world's economy. That's an important point, and this has actually been the case for well more than 10 years. Now, this point was missed in the 1990s. So when you look back at all of these ideas about liberal democracy, about globalization and the development of the global marketplace, and about geopolitical competition, did all of these analysts just simply, were they just naive? Were they ignorant? No, these were some of the most sophisticated thinkers we had. So why did they get it wrong? Well, I think that one of the reasons they got it wrong is because they framed their problem in a particular way for a particular audience. And when you do that, you're operating in what we call a paradigm, and that paradigm determines what data you select for your analysis. Now, we all do this. We always come to solving a problem. We don't come to it with a blank slate. We always come with assumptions, with a framework. And this is an important example of what I think in the last 10 or 20 years we've begun to pay much more attention to, which is the problem of cognitive bias. That is the problem of how we come to problems with predetermined ideas, with a mindset where we expect the past to pretty much, the future to look pretty much like the past. We don't expect the future to be radically different. Where because of what we expect to be a likely solution, we tend to select certain data that conform, to the solution we have in mind. This is, cognitive. There are many examples of this. I talk about cognitive bias because it's such an important issue when you're dealing with cultures around the world. You have to be aware of your cognitive biases. You will not be free of none of us will. Doesn't matter what your level of education is. Scientists, when they approach problems, they come with a paradigm and they frame a problem in a certain way and look for certain data. And in fact, the beauty of science is that it doesn't matter what framework you come with. If in the end your experiment is invalidated by observed results, by data, then you have to change your paradigm. That's it. But we all have our cognitive biases, and the best we can do is to be aware of them and make an attempt, to modify our. And this is going to be very important, and I'll talk a bit more about this toward the end in terms of working as a practitioner in global work, international work, cross-cultural work. So I've sort of very quickly given a broad brush description of how our expectations of the world after the fall of the Berlin Wall, at the end of the Cold War, how our expectations to some extent were contradicted by the actual experience, to some extent, because I don't want to say that all of our predictions were complete failures. They were not. In fact, I'm simplifying to a large extent. But I'm doing that. I'm overstating certain points to make a more general point. And if you wish to challenge what I'm saying or have a different view, please. This is great because we should be challenging each other when we talk about subjects like this. But I want to very quickly, and this comes to the question I'd originally set myself up to. Gina, how are we doing for time?
We're good. I know you wanted to give us some tips. Are you at that point?
I will. Okay, I'll come to that. Let me look to the future, and I'll come to tips.
Eight minutes before the Q&A.
Okay, very good. Okay, so remember, I started out this discussion saying that we should be thinking. We are all thinking. I'm interested in how the world is going to evolve in the next 2, 5, 10 years. I don't know. I'm not a soothsayer. I can't make predictions, but I can, on the basis of data and information we have, models that we use, suggest a number of plausible, highly likely scenarios which we could test as we go along. I think the way to think about this. You have to think about what are some of the biggest drivers of change. Now, we can, depending on your discipline, we can set up all kinds of different models, depending on whether you're a climate scientist, depending on whether you are an economist, a political scientist. I think whatever you do, there are at least two large buckets of factors which have to enter the analysis, which will invariably, shape your analysis, your scenario. The first bucket I'm going to call demography or population, and the second bucket, it's a very large bucket, I'm going to call technology. Now, demography or population, why is that important? Because we are at a very unusual juncture in history. In fact, this we can say is unprecedented in terms of population. Number one, never in history before have we seen both the reality and the prospect of large, long-lived populations everywhere in the world. And you can look at life expectancy everywhere in the world. Everywhere in the world, it can be as low in the mid-50s to 60s. In Russia, that's the range in which it has been. In the United States and other countries. The United States is not the best example, by the way, among industrial countries. In fact, our life expectancy, as you know, has fallen by 2 years. Tragic development. It can be in the low 80s. So that would be the life expectancy of a man or a woman. Women tend to live a little longer. Now, this is a very recent development. Up till the middle of the 19th century, it was more common for people to live 30, 40, maximum 50 years on average. And it wasn't until fairly recently, I'm talking about the end of the 19th century, so all the 4 or 5 millennia before, this was the life expectancy. It wasn't until the availability of potable water, antibiotics, a number of other developments that we see this rise in life expectancy. Okay, the consequence of this increase, and this is a universal phenomenon, it is also true in villages in Africa. This life expectancy has been on the increase. As a consequence of this, we're seeing an important demographic shift in the world. And what people who study this call the demographic transition. Probably familiar to many of you. And in this demographic transition, it's a transition from a fairly young population to a fairly old population. Okay, young and old being defined by the average of the median age in that population. Now, we're all, as individuals, becoming old. Okay, that's not news to us. But countries are also aging. Okay, but they're not aging at the same rate. So what we're seeing is that in certain parts of the world, in Europe, for example, this is also true in Japan, the median age has become very high, but even more specifically, the portion of the population that you might call retirees, or that's no longer in the workforce, and those that are under 15 or 16, this is how we define the working age population, is increasing relative to the working age population. In other words, there are going to be more and more people proportionately in the population who are dependent on the working age population. Okay, that has already become an acute problem in Europe, in Japan, to a lesser extent, but this is also in the United States. Because the United States, together with Australia and I think also Canada, are probably the 2 or 3 countries in what we call the industrial world, which are likely to see their populations grow through 2050, whereas that's not going to be true of other industrial countries, broadly speaking. But this change is also within the so-called developing world happening at different rates. So if you look at Asia, Japan is already an old society. So is Singapore. So relatively speaking is Malaysia. These are countries where the proportion of the working age population in relative terms is shrinking. So they're becoming more and more dependent on countries which have younger populations. So you see a lot of the working population now in Malaysia, Singapore, and even in Japan, dependent now on migrant labor from neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Burma. Same thing is true in Europe. It's even true in China. There are pockets of China where migrant labor from Vietnam, other places are beginning to come in, even in Japan. So this is a major shift at the same time that this is taking place. We're also seeing that these younger cohorts in major economies such as China, India, for example, are becoming part of a growing middle class or consumer class. In fact, together they are larger than the middle classes in North America or in Europe. And as a result of which, they are having an increasing influence on global taste and on consumption, even on where research is being done. Scientists, there are going to be more and more scientists and engineers in these locations than elsewhere. This is going to unfold and is going to be increasingly evident in the next 20 or 30 years. We often talk about China versus the United States, and I know that a lot of people are concerned about China becoming a larger economy. Some people say it's already a larger economy than the United States. I don't think that's quite true, but I think it will be, definitely not in the next 2 to 3 years by certain measures, definitely within this decade. The Chinese economy will be the largest economy in the world. The US will be second, and very soon India will also join its ranks. So China and India will reclaim their historical status going back about 3 centuries as the world's largest economy. We can almost say this is as a highly probable development in the next few years. Okay, more things we can say about population. I just want to highlight a few things and a few other things very quickly. Nigeria will have a larger population than the United States by 2050. India will have a larger population than China. Turkey will have a larger population than Russia. So lots of interesting things we can uncover, and I think it is going to affect, I think, the dynamics of world politics and the world economy. Technology. Now, many aspects of technology, this is a huge subject. I just want to focus on one aspect, and that is artificial intelligence. This is no longer an exotic subject. Artificial intelligence has been fundamentally reshaping production around the world. Most of us don't see back rooms, back offices, or we don't see factories. A lot of automation, a lot of robotization, a lot of AI is now being used, which is displacing labor, doing tasks that human labor could previously do. And we see now a whole slew of studies which has analyzed different tasks that suggest that anywhere from 50% to 75% of human work can now be replaced by a combination of robotics and AI. This is not just science fiction. This is not limited to Europe or the United States. China is one of the world's, in fact, in one of the years I've seen recently, purchases of robotic technology. Big investor in AI. This is going to fundamentally reshape the global workplace, and we're going to see a very different approach to issues of global trade. I mean, no longer will we be talking about low-wage areas as where production is going to be located. That is already shifting very rapidly. So that's another development that's going to occur, which we have to take into account. We also have to take into account what artificial intelligence and social media is going to do in terms of liberal democracies. Remember, we talked about that problem at the beginning. I think it's going to be having a very important impact, the extent of which I think is not yet grasped by most of us. A subject we can also talk about. Now, I want to end very quickly because I promised that I would offer certain tips at the end of this discussion. Do I have about 10 minutes, Gina?
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
Okay, thank you.
So we have a couple of questions in here for after your tips.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, fine. So if you are, and I think everyone in this audience, by the fact of you being in this audience, is a student. I'm a student of globalization, global cultures. You have an interest in engaging with other cultures. You have an interest in the world and how the world is going to evolve. Okay, how can you develop, cultivate, improve your competency in this area? We all can. I think I'm going to put my suggestions into 3 buckets, and hopefully they're not going to be, I don't think they'll be too surprising. And broadly speaking, I'm going to call the first bucket reading, the second bucket travel, and the third bucket critical thinking. Now, what I want to put in these buckets is not simply what the literal meaning of these terms are, but let me go through them one by one very quickly. Reading. I think it's very important, if you can, is to extend your reading to outside your home area or your comfort zone, your traditional areas of reading. If you like reading the newspapers, try and read newspapers from other countries. Now, we're in a remarkable position today, which I did not experience as a person starting out to read newspapers in my youth, where you can select newspapers from the net, from the internet, the World Wide Web, and you can actually follow them fairly closely. I mean, if you don't speak a foreign language, you can still read papers such as The Guardian in the UK, which I read. Spiegel is in English in Germany, one of the leading papers in Germany. Le Monde in France, the Japan Times, Times of India. It's very useful to do this because you will see that depending on where you are in the world, you see the world's news with a different lens. It's good to appreciate that lens. Now, if you read a foreign language, even better. Okay, now, if news or reading newspapers, I'm very biased because I grew up as the son of a foreign correspondent. My father was reading different newspapers from around the world every week, so I started this very early in my life. I enjoy reading papers from all over the world. But another thing you can do is to actually read fiction from different countries, because there are wonderful writers from China, from India, Nigeria, Peru, Russia, Scandinavia, who will give you a very interesting appreciation of how other cultures view the world, even through fiction. And I think a particularly interesting stream of literature is the literature written by young women writers who look at the issues of gender and class in different societies, because these are common issues across the world. And it's not just of interest to women, it should be of interest to all of us. And by the way, let me make a quick point here. I'm often asked, what was your greatest lesson in development, and having worked in development for several decades? My greatest lesson is this: if there's one thing a country can do to lift its society, one thing, besides infrastructure, besides investing in technologies, the most important thing is invest in women's literacy, in the literacy of girls. Make sure that every girl has an education, becomes literate. Number two, make sure that women have entrepreneurial possibilities, that women businesses can flourish. If a country can solve these two problems, you're going to find invariably that almost every other problem, health, education, gets solved. And this is empirically true. You go to a place like Kerala in South India, which is my ancestral home. I've never lived there. My parents came from there. Women's literacy is in the high 1990s, 90s. And as a result of which, health indicators are also extremely high, unusually high for a region of that economic level. Anyway, this is a very important thing. So I think reading these themes by women writers is extremely important. Finally, film also, under the rubric of reading. Explore film, a lot of independent directors, wonderful film coming out of South Korea, China, again, India, many countries around the world. This would be, I think, a very good way to give you a window into how other countries are experiencing not just their own cultures, but the world, the whole process of globalization. Second area, related to the first, is travel. I think it's very important for us to learn to become literate travelers. That when we visit a country, of course, it's wonderful, to visit the famous monuments, the cathedrals, the various interesting landscapes, great stuff, wonderful photos, but try to prepare yourself, if you have time, by reading some of the literature of the country, the history of the country. Now, many of us don't have, the time. We prepare a trip, in advance, but, we're busy with our work lives, family lives, and so on. I get that. But if you make a little bit of effort to prepare yourself before, you will suddenly find that it opens tremendous doors, and you begin perceiving your experience is a very different one. I'll give you just one. I took a cruise in Russia a few years ago, going from St. Petersburg to Moscow. In the months before that, I actually achieved one of my life's ambitions, which was to read War and Peace, a book by Tolstoy from cover to cover. I hadn't done that. I did that very recently. And I'm a very slow reader when it comes to fiction. I read nonfiction very fast, but in fiction, it took me about 6 weeks to do that, especially that I was doing it both in English and French, because it was different. It was a very different experience. Anyway, it helped my experience of Russia tremendously. So try and inform yourself. The third area is critical inquiry and thinking. Now, this is extremely important. I think we're all endowed as human beings with this capacity for reasoning, for measurement, for observation. We need to be trained to use those gifts that we have as a species to engage in truly critical inquiry and open-ended inquiry. Now, some people like to say this is just the scientific method, and this is to a large extent the scientific method. It's not just the scientific method, but to a large extent it is. And this is, if we want a universal legacy, we should practice this, particularly in this era of fake news. We need to find out informed sources. We need to develop ways of testing ideas and news that we are receiving. And I want to finish maybe I won't have time, but I want to finish very quickly with this 4x4, this 2x2 matrix I talked about, where when you enter a cultural experience, you have to enter with a certain degree of skepticism and an understanding that the questions that you ask cannot be completely answered. Because there are things you know, there are things you don't know. There are things you don't know, because it's a process of discovery, and it's simply things you don't know that you don't know. One very critical experience I had was when I was asked to go help reform telecommunications in the Western African country of Mauritania. Something I was a little reluctant to do because at that time in the mid-1990s I was doing some other interesting projects, and I said, I don't really want to go to Mauritania, I'm busy, but I went there saying, okay, I'll spend 2 days there, I'll leave my team, they can take it up. This was one of the most fascinating experiences in my life, because as I gave my presentation about how telecom's principles should be practiced, very confident, giving my 1 hour of 100 PowerPoints, I was looking around that room of officials from the telecoms company, military people, and I was wondering, wow, this is a very strange society of nomads. I have no idea how all of this will play out, how this is being received. And I actually went back to my hotel room and I wrote a little poem that afternoon called Fugitive Doubts, because I began doubting myself in some respect. And then I have that poem somewhere, and I started writing, look, here I am very confident of what I know, what I can present. But as I survey the faces around me, these windswept faces from the desert, doubts creep in my mind. Is this the right thing for this society? And then the doubts leave me and I continue with my presentation. Anyway, just even having that kind of engagement with myself about what I knew and did not know opened me up, to understanding what these people were thinking. We had a wonderful partnership. This became a project that was extremely successful. I got interviewed at the World Bank many times. Why was it so successful? I was very surprised, by the way, that I was interviewed by this. This should be a normal project. And I remember one debriefing, I was debriefed for about 2 hours, and at the end I said, I think what really worked is we listened. Very, very important. Not just simply literally listening, but listening for ideas. And again, putting all the ideas that you're getting from people into this 2x2 matrix. What is it that I know I know? What is it that I know I don't know? Things that I don't know I know, because there's going to be a process of discovery, and things that will really surprise me because I don't know that I don't know them. Okay, let me end on that note. This has been a wonderful experience for me talking to you about so many different subjects, and thank you for bearing with me, and I hope I haven't been too meandering. I would love to hear your questions and observations, and please do try and challenge everything I've said. Thank you.
I'm removing the spotlight, so we should go back to, if you want to have more of a roundtable discussion, I might suggest that you take your view, now you control the view, and just choose gallery. That way we can kind of see each other. You're free to unmute if you have a question. I have some I'm going to ask, and then maybe you want to show your face. If you feel like showing your faces, that's great too. Okay, because I really appreciate everything Govind said. I'm taking furious notes over here for my classes. So much knowledge in one package. It's fantastic. We had a question, Govind, and Govind and I have called each other by our first name for years.
Yeah,
so we both decided you can call us that too.
absolutely.
I believe Juan is one of our international students. Is Juan still here? And he asked, for someone who wants to work at the World Bank, what path do you recommend is the best way to get there, educationally or professionally? And you tell me that first. What's the path? Is there
Okay, this is a good question. Now, I'm often asked this. I've given talks specifically on the World Bank. When I was at the World Bank in particular, now I've since left. It's been about 10 years, I will say, that I've been at the bank, and I've moved into so many other areas that I'm not sure that I can give you a precise answer for one. But here are some thoughts that I have. I know that certainly at the time that I joined the bank and when I was recruited, there was a very, very, very strong bias, which to some extent is still there, in favor of an education in economics. You do need a grounding, at least to some extent, in economics, and the more you can get, the better. But there are other areas. We have lawyers at the bank. We have people who are special financial specialists. We have disbursement specialists. So there are a number of other areas too that you can follow, and I think are very important. I consider myself to be a generalist because I pursued so many careers at the bank. I just enjoy. I'm not necessarily sure this is the best thing to do having a long-term and successful career is your goal, though I did fine. I have no complaints about that. But I think you can enter as a specialist. Probably the best way is to have several years of experience under your belt, preferably in what we used to call, some people still call them developing countries. I can come to that notion. Spend some time on a project, and certainly having one or two advanced degrees, a master's in public policy, a master's in economics, or a more specialized area, demography, public health. These are also great areas. And more recently, I would say some of the more scientific disciplines relating to energy, for example, climate science. I think having a technical background plus some experience is very helpful. Of course, languages always help. And the most important languages at the bank, World Bank, French, Spanish, Mandarin to some extent. China is becoming less and less of a borrower country, Arabic. So languages will also help. And the ability to, I think, express yourself clearly. A good undergraduate and graduate education gives you all of that.
That's great. I believe that Juan was never one of my students, but I believe that Juan is multilingual, and I think he's ready to graduate pretty soon, right, Juan?
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. Thank you so much, by the way, for answering and taking my question. Yeah, I currently speak French, Spanish, and English, but working at the World Bank has always been a big dream of mine, and a little bit of a reach, but still it's a dream. So
Now, Juan, I don't know these programs, and I apologize, I can't give you a precise answer because I've been out of the bank, but we used to have a track where we recruited people, I believe, after they had a graduate degree. It was called a junior associate or a junior professional associate, I don't remember. And I know I had several of them work for me, so this is how I know. They may still have this program. I'm pretty sure they have the program. So if you look up junior associate, or you may already junior, that's a good way to at least get some exposure. It's limited for 2 years, but I know many people who've gone from that program to getting longer term contracts or full-time employment at the World Bank. So that may be a path to explore.
I'm so happy he's asking that, and that I asked you to talk about the World Bank a little bit. But he also asked, what is the biggest challenge facing the World Bank in the 21st century?
Okay, the way I would like to ask that question is not so much to ask what the challenge to the World Bank is, but what the challenge to the world is for an organization with the mission of the World Bank. That's how I would frame the question. And of course, in looking at it that way, you also ask, well, how does the World Bank have to adapt? So what's the biggest challenge to the World Bank? Oh, I think there are several. First of all, I think the whole problem of development has changed in the world. I mean, there was a time in the 1960s when you could fairly, or 1970s, you could fairly easily divide the world into so-called developed countries and developing countries. We even use terms such as third world. I think there's a much greater degree of differentiation now in the world, and that some countries, I think I'll take Malaysia as an example. Malaysia is not a country that, to some extent, even China is not a country where we should be using the term developing country. I don't know exactly what term. I mean, China may say we're not yet a developed country, but the reason I say this is because if you look at countries certainly if you look in the United States, if you take a city like Washington, D.C., where I used to live, you can draw a circle around certain areas in any major metropolitan area in the United States. And if you look at infant mortality statistics, you look at educational attainment indicators and so on, they can look very similar or even worse than Jamaica or some African country. This is true. And increasingly we have a problem of poverty in the United States and other countries, which I think forces us to kind of revisit this whole question of what development is, how it should occur. I think this is very important. Related to this problem is the problem of inequality, particularly inequality within countries. Now, we used to think, again, in the old terminology, developed versus developing countries, that there was inequality between countries. In fact, what has happened is we're seeing more and more convergence among countries. So countries are actually catching up. In the United States, when we talk about China, we worry about, the U.S. declining. Well, it's the story of the relationship between China and the United States is not a story so much of the decline of the United States. It's a story of the catch-up of China, which is actually a somewhat different issue. Though there is some aspect of decline. I mean, when the U.S. uses two years in terms of life expectancy, this is a serious problem. Life expectancy in China and the United States are now just about the same, whereas 10 or 20 years ago, China was 10 years behind in terms of life expectancy. So I think that the increased differentiation across countries, the increased inequality within countries, China and the United States are among the most unequal societies in the world. But you see the same problem to a different extent in different countries. I think this is also another important problem, and it sort of invites the question: how do we have countries integrate into the world economy when there is such inequality, and when some of the issues such as training of workers, tax structure, expenditure on social expenditures, health and education, these are very, very important, and they can determine whether a country can be a successful player in the world economy or not. Successful in the sense that you have broad-based growth. Obviously, one of the biggest problems we're going to face, this is true across the world, but it's going to affect development in particular, is the problem of sustainability, and particularly the problem of climate change, and how it is going to unequally affect different populations. If you look at countries such as Bangladesh or the Pacific Islands that I visited, even when I visited Kiribati in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, I remember looking out at that atoll and looking at the water level, and I kept thinking, my gosh, it only requires about a meter rise in water level to completely submerge this place. And these are threatened, endangered places, the Maldives, a lot of small islands, a lot of delta regions in Vietnam, Bangladesh, the entire, if you want, coastal rim in Asia. I mean, all these cities that are along the coast, including big cities like Shanghai, Bangkok, and so on, are threatened by sea level rises. So I think this is a big problem, and I think this problem invites the question as to how we need to change globally, because many of these problems, such as climate change, and the pandemic is another problem, are problems that are intrinsically global in nature. It's not just a question of China having a more friendly policy toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because it doesn't matter where those greenhouse gases originate, whether it's from a cattle producing area in Brazil or a factory in Shanghai. They all contribute to a global atmosphere and a global level of greenhouse gases. So we do need a coordinated global solution, just as we need a coordinated global solution if we are going to deal with future pandemics. So I think these are some of the challenges that the World Bank and other such institutions face, an increasing need for effective coordination around the world.
Thank you. And thank you, Juan, for asking that. Govind, we have a really interesting group of people. Actually, two people from Greece are here. One is actually zooming in from Greece, one of my students.
Great.
And we have, graduating people I've seen in first-year foundations. And we also have an incoming first-year student who I invited to come because he wants to take up the minor in global cultures, and his name is Santino or Tino. And he asks, do you think that studying global cultures and economics would be beneficial for someone who is interested in going into politics, working in government? That's probably...
Well, I have a bias in answering that question, so I'm going to immediately say yes, but let me not leave it at that. Let me say why. Okay. Wherever in the world you are, whatever profession that you seek to engage in, you are going to increase. We're all going to increasingly have to be engaged globally, because the issues that are intrinsically global in nature. I mentioned climate change. I mentioned pandemics. There are a number of other issues which require a global approach, and it requires global thinking. It requires an appreciation for the need for an effective global architecture where somehow we can coordinate our actions. We are a world society of approximately 195, maybe a few more governments. Well, how do you get them to act in tandem to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How do you get them to engage in global biosurveillance so we reduce or mitigate the risk of another pandemic, the probability of which is very high. And I'm not talking about COVID-19, I'm talking about the next pandemic. And these are things that are predictable and predicted. This pandemic, although this specific pandemic wasn't predicted in 2016 or even before, there were a lot of signals that something like this would happen. I remember this from 2003 when I was living in Indonesia. We were dealing with something called the avian flu. I was working with a lot of public health experts, and I was beginning to look at some of these epidemiological models and realized the probability of something like this happening is very high, because everywhere around the world, we are all becoming more and more urban. More than half the world's population now lives in cities. We are also living closer to animals, whether it's as in China in this wet market, or having pets and so on. These are, if you want, habitation patterns that increase the risk for transmission, between animal populations and human populations. Well, this is something that we're going to have to deal with in a coordinated way, because we can't isolate these problems, into one locality. It affects all of us. So I would say, as a politician, to be conversant with these issues, you have to think globally. You have to think about these issues, because you're going to meet, at the very least, you're going to be working with colleagues, both within your country and with other counterparts in the world, who are going to have to deal with these issues.
In other words, we're going to encourage Tino to keep going along that path, and
Absolutely.
definitely keep studying what he plans to study for that. And our last question today is from Anna. I really wish you all could let me see your faces, let him see your faces. But Anna is a graduating senior. I had her in class last, there she is. And Anna, why don't you ask the question yourself then?
Hi, so I'm actually a communications major, and global cultures is one of my minors. So I wanted to know a little bit more about, does communications or telecommunications affect cognitive bias, and what role does that play in the development of globalization?
Wow, Anna, thank you. That is such a great question. That is actually a very large question. But let me try to bound it and see if I can at least give you some of my thoughts on it. Telecommunications, well, the revolution in telecommunications, and by that I also mean the development of the internet, the World Wide Web, social networks, social media, has created a new pattern of exchange of information that we have not seen before. Okay, you can hold up a telephone, and everyone can now be, you can be a publisher, you can be a TV station, you can be a radio station with just your phone, right? This is something that's also has not occurred historically before. But the important thing is you can also form networks which exchange information, exchange data. Now, there are lots of positive things about that. It gives you opportunities, as we were talking about, reading the world's newspapers, learning about things that, we could not have done before. But it also gives an opportunity for a lot of disinformation, a lot of fake news, as we call it, to be very quickly transmitted and to almost infect a network, which becomes a bubble that is impervious to outside information. This is a growing risk around the world. We see this play out in the United States. In many ways, we're seeing these risks develop elsewhere. And I think understanding the dimensions of this risk, why it occurs, and understanding what we might be able to do about it at an individual level in terms of becoming much more of a critical thinker, yes, that is important. But I think at a societal level, there are also things that we need to begin to do. And that we need to begin also to ask ourselves, who owns all this data about ourselves? There was a time when those of us who were concerned about civil liberties would be worried about, well, how much does the government know about me? In all of these data stores. Although that's still a question of concern, the question I really worry about right now is, how much does a small handful of private corporations know about me that I don't know about myself, which enables them to predict my behavior in the next 1, 2, or 3 or 4 years in a way that I can't do? This is actually a big problem, because with all the databases that we have about our consumption habits, genetic databases and so on, and with the algorithms that one can employ, there is an increasing power of predictive analytics that a small number of corporations now almost monopolize, which enable them to make predictions about our behaviors, that in some ways could sometimes be adverse to us, in terms of insurance and a number of other areas. Now, this is a big subject, and I think you are on to something that is very important, Anna, in your question. And this could be it is the subject of many books, many theses. I hope you and others will continue to think seriously about it, because I personally think this is one of the biggest challenges we're going to have to face as a global society in the next 10 years.
Agreed. And that's a great question, Anna. Thank you all for your questions. And we're coming to the end of our time together. So I wanted to mention that I put some of the articles, there's some short reading articles that Govind had suggested for the students in my class, and I copied them in and the hot links didn't come along. So I will be happy to share those if you just email me at gina.morrison@Wilkes. And very, very interesting, so things like globaloni, the world is not flat yet. And you talked about some of these things. But I really want to thank all of you for your attendance today. It's a pleasure to spend a little bit of time with you. But most of all, I must thank our speaker, Professor Govind Nair, for spending this time. I just wish we could do a whole series. I would love to have you back and back and back again. Every time we talk with you, it really expands my thinking, and really, you speak with a lot of hope. You acknowledge the problems, but you seem to have a lot of hope. Any final words today?
No, I want to thank all of you, because this has been an unusual experience for me to be able to kind of zoom out onto so many different topics. But I feel that it is important, and I feel that, almost as the representative of one generation and talking largely, to a younger and in a future generation of thinkers and leaders, this kind of dialogue is extremely important. And we're going to learn from each other. I'm going to learn from you too. So we should be engaging collectively on these kinds of issues more and more. And we should be engaging as global citizens with open minds. There aren't just experts with the solutions anymore. Global citizens, global scientists, citizen scientists, people engaging in civil society have a huge role to play. So I'm excited by this track that we're developing of having more conversations like this. And once again, I thank you all, for your questions and for giving me the opportunity to expound on so many different things. And I wish you all well. Please be safe, and please be well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Everyone, I'll just stay on a few minutes in case anyone wants to ask a question you didn't want to put in the chat. And otherwise, I'll bid you good night and hope to see you at the next session. Thank you all. Good night.
Okay.